Hello and welcome. Really pleased that you could join us today. My name's Diane Warner, as you can see on the screen, and I'm here with my co-convener colleagues, Simon Salaji and Christine Callender. You can also see their names on the screen as well. So this event is run by our special interest group for race, ethnicity and education, learning about race from Norway, which is fantastic. And in just a few seconds, I will introduce our speaker, Kristen, for you. Can I just check first, though, that unless you're speaking, if you can have your microphones muted, and then that hopefully will avoid any problems with echoes and returns of coming back to us and things like that. It's a real pleasure to welcome you from across the UK and colleagues from Norway and further afield as well. So it's really heartening to have an international event like this. So I met Kristin, who's also my research mentor, Karen Pashby, who's also here today, and met Kristin about 18 months ago or so at the ERA conference, the European Educational Research Association conference, when it was in Glasgow that year. So thank you, Karen, for putting us in contact with each other. But Kristin's got some really important research and knowledge to share with us. So I'm just going to read out her biography as a way of introduction. Okay, so Kristin Grieges Eriksen is an associate professor in social studies education at the University of Southeastern Norway. She is head of the research group in social studies education and convener of the Nordic Educational Research Association's network on critical race, racism and whiteness in education, which is a little bit like the equivalent to our special interest group in BERA. Her research and publications include anti-racist and citizenship education, Indigenous and Sami perspectives in education, decolonial theory and pedagogy, and sustainable development in and through education. She works extensively as an academic researcher and activist to promote the rights and citizenship of the Sami people in Norway and the education of and equalities for Sami children. Kristin is the author of several textbooks and learning materials for both primary schools and teacher education. And one of her books back in 2022, we were just discussing before we started, was the book that was edited or co-edited by the BERA president, Marlon Moncrief. So Kristin's got a lot of links with BERA as well. Okay, so that's Kristin. What we're going to do is Kristin's going to do her talk, and then co-convener of our SIG, Christine, is going to give the vote of thanks and summary at the end for a short while. And then Simon, our other co-convener, is going to field questions. So please be jotting down your questions as Kristin is giving us her talk. So thank you very much. So your PowerPoint seems to have gone off screen. I don't know if it's going to come back on screen in a second.
Yeah.
But over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Diane. And let's see now if it works as well as it did in the when we tried. So
yes, we can see that now. Thank you.
yeah, but without the notes, right? Only the
Without
presentation.
the notes.
Yeah.
We can only
good.
see the presentation, yes.
That's good. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Diane, for the introduction. I'm very happy for the invitation and the opportunity to come here to talk to you about this. And as Diane kind of implies, I'm coming to this work on anti-racist and decolonial education from sort of combination of perspectives and positionalities. So I work in teacher education. I do my research related to mainly anti-racism, decolonial pedagogies, and some indigenous education. I work as a teacher educator. But I've also, of course, been engaged in these topics as an activist, as a human being, having my Norwegian and Sami backgrounds. And also I worked quite extensively with developing teaching materials and disseminating research for both the practice field, so teachers and schools, but also for children. So all of this is part of where I speak from. And I find it hard to kind of separate these different parts of myself. So it might appear a bit messy, like all of these aspects are going to be a little bit intertwined in the presentation, but I'll try to structure the presentation or the talk into three main topics, three main parts. So in the first part, I will talk about race, racism, and coloniality in the Norwegian context. In the part I've called the invisible in plain sight, so it kind of hints at what I'm going to talk about there, but I think it's important to try to provide a context and a background for understanding these topics from the Norwegian context. And I will be very interested to hear afterwards if you kind of recognize a lot, if it's different from your context, and how we can think about this. And then in the second part, I will take you more into the classrooms and my research from the classroom. And I've called this section the effectively present absences. And this refers to some of the findings and analysis in some of my research, which I will come back to. And then in the third section, I will talk about implications, interruptions, how can we think about the things that we have now been touching upon. So these are kind of the three main topics, strands that I will cover today. So hopefully it will make sense to you, but as I say, it will come a bit from here and there maybe. Yeah. So first, I will start by introducing you to a case that I'm working on analyzing with my colleagues right now. So in January 2021, an article was published on the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation's news web pages titled "Serious Case of Bullying Shakes Up Southern Municipality." And the article describes what has later been known as the Lillesand case, named after the small city where the events took place, involving three young sisters who were exposed to racist bullying, harassment, and physical violence by peers, both inside and outside school premises and also on social media over a period of 2 years. Now, the article includes screenshots from the social media messages where the sisters are portrayed as monkeys that should return to the jungle, referred to by using the N-word, and told to leave the municipality and go back where they came from. And the sisters were also threatened with knives and beaten repeated times. Now, in the surrounding media debate, both representatives from the police, school leaders, and local politicians repeatedly claimed that the events were not to be understood as racism, carefully applying the label of bullying. So as the father of one of the involved students declared, this is a case about a long-lasting conflict, but it's not about racism. So the sisters litigated the case on basis of breach of their legal right to safe educational environment according to the Education Act, bringing the case before the local court in 2023. But their appeals were largely declined. So such denials of racism can be understood in the context of a long-standing pattern of denial of race and racism as relevant to understanding Norwegian present-day society as well as history. And this also frames how racism is understood and presented, or maybe not presented, in the education system and schools. So there are several aspects that can help explain this phenomenon, which of course also bear similarities, I would say, to other ideas of post-raciality that you may know about throughout the European contexts. But as we see in public discourses, racial and colonial ideologies are constructed as common sense so that statements are reformulated without making visible the racial predicates on which they are grounded. So what Ranji and Archetti describe as the invisible in plain sight. Now, in the Lillesand case, the denial of racism and the upholdings of the school as a white space is actively produced by displacing racism with the concept of bullying. So the not racism argument is here a quest to control the definition of racism, or in this case, to externalize it from the self-understanding of the school. And what is important to know as a background for this also is that in 2005, Norway removed any references to the concept of race in legal instruments. So hence, Norway currently has laws against ethnic but not racial discrimination, which also makes it hard to talk about. And despite documentation of racial discrimination in areas like the labor market, housing, sports, interpersonal interactions in Norway, this is almost never described as racism. And this inability to name racism and the taboo concerning race is also related to the fact that Norway has a comparatively weak tradition of social science research on racism, and some of the resistance towards applying a vocabulary and an analytical framework concerning race and racism actually also comes from researchers themselves, arguing that the concept of racism should be reserved for explicit ideologies, race hierarchies, and that the concept is used in an unqualified fashion or too widely, and thereby it tends to lose its scientific value, this argument goes. And in addition, empirical research is also difficult, as any statistical overviews regarding racial backgrounds are illegal. So we will have registries on immigrant backgrounds, and then on the Sami electoral roll and minority language background in schools and so on, but no official statistics on racial cultural backgrounds. So the time around the Black Lives Matter demonstrations somewhat changed the conversation on racism in Norway. And these shifts were not exclusively connected to the BLM movements, but this is at least a common impression that people tend to talk about, that the BLM started more explicit and honest conversations in some way. And the government adopted a new action plan against racism, and funding was given to research and anti-racist educational activities and measures. So the conversations were in particular stimulated by individuals who share their personal stories and experiences with everyday racism and microaggressions and so on. However, the effort to start such conversations are typically criticized for being marked by moralism and therefore being unconstructive. And they more often than not end up in comments like, yes, this is not okay, but was it really racism? And this is much like we saw in the Lillesand case as well. The blaming of the victim to racism displays the logics of reversal, where anti-racist struggles are blamed for the race in racism. And also claims to the right to name racism in the Norwegian context often come up against social and political imaginaries in which Norway and Norwegians are cast as exceptional, which is crucial to understand, I would say, the Norwegian context, this idea of exceptionalism. So Norway, much in line with the other Nordic countries, has been successful in promoting exceptionalism as a particular form of nation branding and self-understanding. And a common characteristic of this Nordic exceptionalism has been the self-positioning as allegedly outside the history of colonialism. So national exceptionalism disassociates the state from historical and systemic injustice and exalts the nation state and its ideal, and then in reality white, citizens to a place beyond critique. Now, as the former Prime Minister and Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, stated in 2013, Norway is so highly valued because we have no colonial past. Of course, national exceptionalism is not unique to Norway, but it's rather to be understood as part of the modern colonial construction of the nation state based on racial and colonial separations. But I argue that it's quite striking. Well, I don't know, you can maybe comment on this after, but at least to me, when I go abroad, when I go to international conferences talking about this, people tend to be surprised that Norway is not exempt from these processes and forces of coloniality and racism. And so, although actively ignored in discourses on Norwegian history and society, it is now well documented how Norway actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade, notably in Ghana and in the Caribbean, and that Norwegian ship merchants made fortunes from this. But of course, even more pressing is the way this idea of Norway's colonial innocence upholds the sanctioned ignorance of the colonization of Sápmi, which is then the ancestral homeland of the Sami. So the colonization of Sápmi can be traced back to the 14th century at least, but the state-led systematic assimilationist policies from the early 1800s and onward, known as Norwegianization, are often emphasized as the consolidation of colonization. So the Sami, like other indigenous peoples across the globe, were forcibly incorporated into settler colonial states through harsh racist policies such as boarding schools and land and language policies. Norwegianization was also targeted at the national minorities, notably the Roma and the Tate Romani, or the travelers, who were subject to forced adaptations and sterilizations. And these policies towards the Sami and the national minorities were intertwined with Norway and the Nordic countries as such active role in the development of the so-called race science or race biology and eugenics. So now, a little more than 1 year ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on investigation of this Norwegianization policy published a report. And among the conclusions from this work was that the state-led colonial politics known as Norwegianization is still operational in and through social practices and structure. So the report stated that when the Norwegianization policy was discontinued, many of the patterns of actions, attitudes, and social structures that the Norwegianization policy had contributed towards were continued. So in other words, societal processes that led to Norwegianization did not stop. And examples that are used are the common experience of everyday racism among the groups, the lack of fulfillment of the rights to culturally relevant and first language-based education, discrimination in healthcare, and policies and practices concerning land and research management. And now talking about this resource management and land issues. So as the report also implies, the formal and legal recognition of the Sami also stands in contrast to the continuous processes of dispossession of Sami lands and livelihoods through state-led industrial development and infrastructure projects. So this is commonly referred to as green colonialism. And a quite well-known example that you may have heard of is the so-called Fosen case, which has become symbolic related to the rights violations towards the Sami, not least because in this case, the building of wind power plants on Sami reindeer herding land was ruled to be a human rights violation by the Supreme Court in 2021. However, 2 years went by without the government taking any action, neither to alleviate the rights violation, nor to actually recognize it as an ongoing human rights violation, causing major protests. And this is only one among several such cases where the Sami are not given access to define the issues and solutions. So as Eva Fjellheim analyzed, studying some of these corporate and state-led dialogues among related to these cases, these processes present themselves as neutral negotiations, but are in fact entrenched in racist stereotypes, presenting the Sami as backwards or ignorant troublemakers or without knowledge. So in spite of these examples, there is a lot of resistance towards actually describing them through a language of colonialism and coloniality. And even the Truth and Reconciliation report is reluctant towards applying an explicit terminology concerning coloniality, and the use of the terms are met with continuous pushbacks and resistance in public debate and also as a researcher. So this is something that I experience a lot. And so now, although Norwegianization have been discontinued and celebrating diversity has become the official policy, the colonial and racial logics are inscribed into the social fabrics of the welfare state, particularly in educational policy, I would say. And so the Norwegian welfare state, based on what is often called the Nordic social democratic model, is kind of a two-faced construction, because it is, in fact, in many ways a success in promoting justice and egalitarianism through the policies of economic redistribution and how rights and services are based on universalism. So a main example is, of course, how the Nordic model has facilitated free comprehensive education and formally equal access to higher education for all in Norway, which of course is it's fantastic and a key factor for enabling social mobility, at least for some groups. But on the other side, it also fosters a system in which inequalities are invisibilized under the imaginary of an alleged homogeneous national identity as a means for realizing loyalty to the nation. So the anthropologist Marianne Gullestad has described this as equality as sameness. Equality as sameness implies that social actors must consider themselves as more or less the same in order to feel of equal value. So egalitarianism in this form can then in fact have quite inegalitarian consequences, as it is closely related to ideas of homogeneity, social cohesion. And then this again is also connected to whiteness as an ideal for citizenship and civility. So in education, it has been analyzed how this idea of egalitarianism combined with the discourses of diversity work leads to the concept of diversity working as a substitute for non-white or racialized other, and then upholding the reproduction of whiteness as ideal and also basis for sort of conceptualizing the normal student. And so this is operationalized in schools as colorblind pedagogies and practices, and also works to mask structural injustice and racism and construct non-white students as deficient. So a key example for this is how multilingual students are often described with poor language competencies on basis of their skills in Norwegian, even though they may often be more competent, right, in language, learning several languages at the same time and so on. Or that students with particular immigrant backgrounds are overrepresented in special education categories. Okay, so now I've provided sort of an overview of race and coloniality in the Norwegian context. So I will bring you more into the classroom and my research, which revolves around knowledge production, teaching materials, learning processes and practices in schools and education at different levels. And then trying to trace these sort of elusive concepts of race, racism, coloniality, and exceptionalism, and understand how they operate and influence knowledge production and educational spheres, and how they can be interrupted and resisted. We do know from several surveys that children and youth in Norway experience racism in schools in the form of exclusion, underestimation, racist hate speech, violence, and microaggressions. Yet these violations are often unmentioned, downplayed, or misunderstood. So this is also related to how racism often comes to play in more subtle interactions and social processes, which are difficult to judge in a more strict legal sense. And notably, much of it happens in and through learning processes and in the classrooms. And in my research, I'm also particularly concerned with this interrelations between the ignorance of racism in practice and its position or its absence in the curriculum and knowledge production. Now I can see that someone raised their hand, and I'm not sure how to structure the because I was told to wait with comments and questions till after, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can't see whose hand is raised at the moment.
it's Osa.
Yeah, so Simon's saying for Osa, if you could post your questions in the chat for now, Osa, that'd be great. And then we'll have we'll take the questions towards the end, if that's okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So please do post any questions in the chat as we go through. Thank you.
In a 7th grade social studies class in a classroom in southeastern Norway, the students are exploring the topic of slavery. While the teacher connects the historical transatlantic slavery to the present and modern day slavery, the textbook steers the conversation in a different direction. Information about slavery is provided in a chapter titled The Great Explorers. The teacher tells her students, "Today we are going to learn about the Europeans who discovered the world." In this narrative, the coming of modernity, Western science, and industrialization made possible by these processes is presented as the trajectory of human development towards infinite progress. A student raises her hand and asks, "But who discovered Norway then?" The teacher hesitates and answers, "I don't think anyone really discovered Norway. It is more than different people have been living here for thousands of years. We don't usually talk that way about Europe." So this example actualizes to me what Maldonado Torres calls epistemic blindness, where the alleged neutrality and universality of European perspectives reproduce absence in relation to non-European perspectives and ways of thinking, and to the reproduction of coloniality and racism. So my point here is not to tell you that the story is wrong, because from the perspective of a certain group of European white men, this is indeed the way the story looks. I rather want you to focus your attention towards how limited and restricted the narrative is, and how it only enables to understand these events of global history from a very particular standpoint. And a related challenge is how this particular standpoint becomes universalized as what is perceived to be objective facts. So this is what I think the very honest and in many ways very accurate answer from the teacher illustrates when she says, "This is not the way we talk." Slavery appears as a mere footnote in the story, and colonization is not mentioned at all. What also remains unacknowledged is how these processes installed prevailing Eurocentric modes of economic and epistemological domination. So from a decolonial perspective, this epistemological monoculture is further accompanied by an ontological monoculture, where racist structures installed with colonialism are still at work, rendering certain bodies invisible as full human beings intertwined with their alleged incapability to be knowledge producers and actors in history. So this white and Eurocentric curriculum, typical of Norwegian citizenship education, I would say, has been described as selective critical thinking, denoting that critical thinking is held as an ideal, but it's not directed at national institutions, history, or society, but rather focuses on other places and times. And in my research, these patterns manifest in many ways, such as how the global south is presented as petty and backwards, but most strikingly in the avoidance of race and colonialism when portraying the histories of the national minorities and the Sami. So I point out a discursive pattern where the Sami are essentialized and actively constructed as an other through the structure and content of narratives and images. So while the history of the Sami National Day concerns the Sami resistance to Norwegianification, this connection is not mentioned. Rather, the focus is on festivities, reflecting a form of multicultural discourse associated with essentialized cultural traits. And meanwhile, the Norwegian National Day is presented as a victory of a brave process of political resistance by a small and humble people with great detail about the political ideas. And overall, what is described as Norwegian history is presented as progressive and dynamic, associated with specific times and persons, representing sort of the official narrative. And the description of Sami history remains obscured by Orientalist discursive structure. So the visions of time and place are blurred, describing how Sami culture existed a long time ago in an unspecified place. And as I argue, this construction of absences in history and discourses about Norwegian society is it's not just random sort of knowledge gaps because they appear systematically. So it's more what Spivak would call sanctioned ignorances. And so these are discursively productive, meaning that they work to uphold and reproduce this national exceptionalism. Now, discussing these issues with teachers, sort of recurring concerns with them is on the one side what they call like the need to protect the emotions of young students from difficult topics, and also the need to present what they refer to as neutral knowledge. So this is related to the fact that if you work with anti-racist and decolonial research and pedagogy in the Norwegian context, you are often met with the accusation of being too political or too normative. And so to me, it's an important point how this white and Eurocentric curriculum and the choice to present colonialism as an achievement and as progress is in fact also a strongly ideological choice. And related to this, of course, is the aspect of how these kinds of discourses and representations influence minoritized students in the room. As for example, in the example with colonialism, where the brown and black bodies are only present as nameless slaves and passive victims without agency. So this also brings me further to how race operates in the classroom. So in a study of how school leaders deal with racism, a principal stated that, I think it's wrong to say that we focus on racism because we don't. We focus on diversity and inclusion. And this kind of statement reflects the notion that we don't have to speak about racism because we're rather concerned with celebrating diversity and friendship and so on. So in the classrooms I visit, I often encounter race as a socially performative presence, but not explicitly spoken with words. A vocabulary related to race and racism is not applied, but is still present and structures the conversations, as well as the more informal interactions between the students. And this is why I describe race in the classroom as an affectively present absence. So its necessity is detectable exactly in the way its absence is actively produced in and through discursive practices. And so the patterns of appearance are, for example, denials of racism while making clearly racist comments, describing it as joking around, and the implicit centering of whiteness within images of Norwegianness and belonging. And so in Norwegian education, anti-racist work is often also connected to the role of attitudes, mirroring what I would say is a kind of limited social psychological understanding of racism. And so what was also striking in my research is the discrepancy between the good intentions and attitudes of both teachers and students and the uninterrupted reproduction of racialization. So importantly, the majority of teachers and students express clearly that racism is morally wrong and a desire to include and acknowledge the racially minoritized students. But when I discuss racism with the teachers, they also construct it as something that is going on other places, and that kind of any problems that they might have at their school with exclusion, bullying, so on, this is not connected to racism. So I argue that this discomfort concerning seeing race safeguards a white affective equilibrium in the classroom. And it also manifests in how the care of what is predominantly white teachers are oriented towards the white students' risks of feeling accused of complicity in racism rather than the students who are exposed to racism. And so this ignorance of experiences with racism can also be understood, I would say, in relation to a very strong kind of liberal, democratic, deliberative ideal of citizenship education, where especially the ideas of free speech is a strong part of the national exceptionalist imaginary of Norway. So it's held very high in how citizenship education is understood and practiced. A recent case from the media in Norway is how the Fritt Ord Foundation, which is a private non-profit foundation that seeks to promote freedom of expression and public debate, gave an award to a group of white teachers speaking out about how difficult it is to teach about racism when risking the accusation of being accused of being racist by their students. And this also happened in context of racially minoritized students calling out about the burdens they experience when, for example, the N-word is used in the classroom. And another interesting aspect from my research is that while teachers often see racism as something that's a little bit too extreme to talk about maybe with the students, especially with the younger ones, the students to a much larger extent express that racism is relevant for their everyday lived experiences. And I also saw how many of the students engaged in sort of micro-level anti-racist work in their everyday interactions. In particular, how racially minoritized students perform resistance towards these limited discursive categories. So for example, with this girl that I got to know who I called Sarah, who very actively opposed any ideas that she might be limited in some way by her Somali family background and her black skin, by sort of deviating from these expectations and stating things that she was aspiring to become the next Norwegian prime minister. And it kind of shows the way racialization can be opposed by what Lugones calls active subjectivity, but it is also placing upon Sarah to perform a type of emotional labor that the majority students are free from. And research also finds that for many racially minoritized students in Norway, they take the positionality themselves of the foreigner, which is also often associated with being a troublemaker or being deficient. And so the school space also very actively reproduces exclusion and otherness in this way. Okay, so what should we sort of think about this situation, and what are the implications from this sort of maybe a bit discouraging image? And of course, it is possible also to tell a story of hope. It is true that recently Norwegian academia has made efforts towards broadening its approach to diversity, implementing new policies, expanding programs on diversity and intersectionality, kind of beyond gender, which has been a focus in the Norwegian context for quite a while. And this is also accompanied by growing visibility and interest in research on racism across the Nordics, as I'm also here today representing the Nordic Educational Research Association new special interest group or network on critical race, racism and whiteness. And we started this now almost 3 years ago now. And it has been able to sort of position itself as an established part of the research association. And then also with growing interest among researchers. And then we see a rapidly increasing focus on visibility of racism and anti-racism as topics and focus areas in education and schools in Norway, something which is also spurred by a growing research base that documents and describes the workings of racism from the particularities of the Norwegian context. And then the Truth and Reconciliation report, together with the court ruling in recognition of the human rights violation towards the Sami on Fosen, has also spurred awareness and knowledge about the situation of the Sami and increased support for rights, as well as the visibility and representation of the Sami in the cultural sphere and in the media. However, what I also argue is that much of the policy and practice still remains situated within a framework of diversity work and celebrating differences that takes on a colonial shape. So while the concept of diversity is extensively used in educational policy and research concerning anti-racism in Norway, this often takes on a neoliberal shape that work to obscure coloniality, racism, power structures, in the common way of treating diversity as kind of a checkbox. And one example that I've encountered myself is how I, as a writer of textbooks and teaching materials for primary and middle school, have met a strong resistance towards applying this kind of language. So it was a very hard process to be even allowed to actually use the word colonialism and write about this in a chapter that was about indigenous peoples and histories. And then when we presented to the publishing house what we wanted to write about racism and anti-racism, we were told that we could not use words like black and white, and that it might be more appropriate to focus on friendship and diversity rather than racism. And this, of course, also has to do with the fact that writing textbooks in Norway is a commercial process where all the textbooks compete openly on the market. So it's important to be popular. But the restricting of thematizing racism actually also led me and my co-writers to resign from our contract and rather publish our work on racism and anti-racism together with a national TV channel for children called NRK Super. And you see a picture from this TV show up there in the corner. So I do think an important step to interrupt coloniality and racism in the Norwegian context is this actual development of a more accurate, nuanced, and diverse curriculum, and providing the students with better knowledge. And this, in my view, both concerns the ability to understand history and societal processes properly, and the empowerment to name and resist racism in their own lives. So when we made this TV series for children, we also had sort of a panel of children and youth providing their feedback on it. And what they said is that please do not make this into a social studies lesson. And I think that what they meant by this is an experience of social studies and citizenship education not being honest or presenting the lived realities to which they can relate. So for me, an important principle in this work is to take children and youth seriously and provide different answers to understanding racism than the usual explanations of, they do not know better, which is quite common. And another part of this work has also been the efforts to try and translate anti-racist and decolonial theoretical frameworks into didactical approaches for critical thinking in the classroom, as critical thinking is such a core aspect of Norwegian citizenship education, and as the idea of sort of neutral and apolitical knowledge production is often used to disqualify conversations about racism and colonialism. So in this approach, we focus on the need to think critically not only about knowledge, but also how knowledge is produced, and knowledge and power, and then enabling a diversity of perspectives, notably by integrating indigenous and Sami knowledges in the core knowledge base, so not only as cultural representations, but part of the actual knowledge base. But then also, from my analysis, I argue that this work with a diverse curriculum, representation, and critical thinking is not enough. From a decolonial perspective, the absence of indigenous Black and racialist bodies in educational narratives can be understood not simply as an exclusion, but as a manifestation of the coloniality of being. So by this, I mean the positioning of the Eurocentric white male standpoint as the definition of rationality based on a modern colonial Cartesian logic. So the consequence is that even in the presence of minorities and of portrayals of racism, the epistemological structures may often render them invisible as knowledge producers and as truths, such as we see both in practice concerning the lack of acknowledgement of racism, such as in the Lillesand case that I started with, as well as in the white and Eurocentric curriculum. So I argue that there is a need for moving beyond the sphere of knowledge and engage also with the ontological baseline. And now to try and explain this a bit more, I will share a model from Andreotti and colleagues, and I know that some of you have seen it before and others might find it a bit complex seeing it for the first time. But this is a mapping of different approaches to decolonizing education. And so they talk about different spheres enabling different types of approaches and associate each sphere with the driving question that you see at the bottom of each box. And although they argue that this model is intended more as a pedagogical than as a normative tool, it is also clear from their analysis that the beyond reform sphere, which concerns ontology, is generally overlooked. And this is also a consequence of the decolonial analysis. So the point is that modernity conditions the responses available to its own violences, naturalizing a grammar of interlinked ontology and epistemology that reinscribes her attempts to interrupt it. And so many of the efforts then remain stuck either in the soft reform sphere, where the focus is on diversity work and inclusion into what is seen as an otherwise well-functioning system and practice, or the radical reform, where efforts are made for addressing power inequalities through representation and inclusion, but also without addressing the deeper roots of the violences. So I argue this need for decolonization, but also, of course, this is not something that can be done by the individual teacher or in the classroom as such, but it needs to start with the level of academia and research. So the last example or sort of case that I will present to you is the debates over decolonization in Norwegian academia and education, or what I also call the non-debates. So debates on decolonization flourished in the media and in academia in Norway around 2018. And this was after the organization called the Students and Academics International Help Fund, SIH, adopted a resolution on the decolonization of academia and higher education. Now, SIH's initiative was inspired by its experiences and insights from working with partners in the Global South, and the acknowledgement that the skewed power relations and epistemic monocultures are relevant in Norwegian academia as well. So both related to white and Eurocentric curriculum and the absence of non-white academics and professors. So in 2020, SIH published a reflection toolkit that was a collective effort of a broad range of activists and academics, including myself, and you see it here on the slide. So this toolkit includes strategies for anti-racist and decolonial work in research and education, such as analyzing the curriculum, thinking critically about epistemological taken for given in different disciplines, how to develop teaching and assessment methods that are inclusive and diverse, recruitment policies, and so on. And in this toolkit, decolonization is described this way. Decolonization does not seek to disqualify Western science, but to enable a widening of our understanding of science. Decolonization of academia is in this sense a process that involves a democratization of research and a strengthening of knowledge by making space for more voices, perspectives, and a wider exchange of opinions. Furthermore, making space for other perspectives and forms of knowledge does not mean to give equal validity to different viewpoints uncritically, but rather to provide equal opportunities and to read them in a balanced relation to Western contributions and with the same critical methodological assessment. And so analyzing the reception and media discourse related to this reveals that the SIH work sparked an accelerating number of articles and op-eds and debates, and most prominently harsh pushbacks. So repeating argument for representing decolonization as dangerous was the idea that it is a threat to academic cultures of truth-seeking and scientific rigor as such. And furthermore, the efforts were described as oozing of identity politics and accused of placing superstitious and mythical knowledges and practices on par with science. Comparing these critiques to the statement by SIH as quoted above, it is clear that the ones opposing decolonization does not really take the time to properly educate themselves on the content of the claims. And so this is the most frustrating part of trying to initiate this conversation, I would say, in a Norwegian context. So upholding that the decolonization movement somehow supports what is called cancel culture, many of the critiques themselves admittedly roots for a full disqualification of decolonization from the Norwegian debate as such. And a related misleading argument upholding this position is the representation of decolonization as something that's external to Norway, that came in as what is described as an international flood and was imported and appropriated from other countries such as the US. And of course, such arguments contradict the broader history of decolonial movements, both globally, but not at least also a long-standing anti-racist movement also in the Norwegian context, notably among Black people and people of African descent, and also Sami thinkers that spans back at least 100 years in the Norwegian context. So the critiques of decolonization to a large extent confirms the challenge that SIH is raising, that there exists an ideal in Norwegian academia of seeing scientific traditions founded in Eurocentric modernity as universally relevant, and an idea of racism and coloniality as something foreign and external. And after these debates flourished, the frequency of the term decolonization has drastically declined from Norwegian media. And I would say that the pushbacks have been quite efficient in almost fully disqualifying this conversation. So I want to end by pointing out that for me, decolonization is a positive, visionary, democratic approach and not an against, as it is often understood as, at least in the Norwegian context. And this misunderstanding often stops what could have opened for new conversations. Because the significance of decoloniality, especially when applied in education, lies not in what it opposes, but in what it is for. It is an analytic and praxis that is for humanization and dignity of all people on equal terms, and for democratization and pluralization of knowledge. So this is my project right now, to try and initiate this conversation and think and envision differently, or as the decolonial theory asks, gesturing towards the decolonial otherwise. And so it seems like the first step in the Norwegian context is to actually allow space for those new conversations to take place. So therefore, I want to thank you for inviting me here today, providing me space, and listening to me. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for that very thought-provoking presentation. I was diligently writing down a lot of notes. I have quite a lot here, but I don't want to take up too much time in summary, because I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of conversation and discussion that will want to take place. I think one of the things I was struck by was just how similar the experience of minoritized communities in Norway is worldwide. You know, this is a common thread, and it seems that we are at different stages in terms of our evolution, in terms of our understanding, in terms of our ability to kind of grapple in a meaningful way with racism. I come from a teacher education background myself. And when I came into the sector in 1995, I was very much wanting to move in a way that was to support our new teachers in terms of their understandings of anti-racism. And I'm now here in 2025 or 2024 doing much the same thing. So this is a very slow process, I think, but there are, I think, successes along the way, albeit small ones. Couple of other things about the ways in which schools respond, or in fact don't respond, to racism. Excusing it as what in the UK we would call banter. So a type of, you know, conversation with young people that is not really racist. You know, they're just kind of joking with each other. And it's interesting that, you know, you were saying that that is a phenomenon that is also found in Norway. And I think that the points you made about how the Sami people in Norway experience this exclusion, it's so similar to indigenous communities in areas where colonization has taken place in other parts of the world. Now I'm going to shut up now because I think there are going to be a lot of people who want to ask questions. So I'm going to hand over to Sima, who I believe is going to handle this bit of the session.
Yes, thank you very much. Christine, can you please unshare your slides for us? Thank you.
Yeah, you wanted me to unshare, right? So
Yes, please.
I've done that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So thank you very much for the presentation, and any questions? So someone just said that they totally agree with Christine that we have in the UK, we have very similar experiences of othering. Any questions? You can either raise your hands or you can post your question in the chat box. Okay, maybe I can start with a question, and the other people can start.
There are some questions.
Oh,
We have
there
got
is.
two.
Yes.
Danielle.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I am a Canadian, and so a lot of your discussion about, indigeneity and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was really resonant with our experience in Canada. And I really liked, you said something about the idea that critical thinking is such a highly valued skill, but we don't really think about where that criticism or that criticality is focused on, right? And that we could be focusing on other systems than the ones that we tend to. How has that conversation been taken up, I guess, in curriculum building or university spaces about what we mean by critical thinking? Or have you experienced conversations about that?
Yeah, and I think there's this ideal of, universalized epistemology is very, very strong in the Norwegian context, like the skepticism towards anything that's outside the sanctioned sort of knowledge base is very strong, and it has had very. So we know this now, that it has had very serious consequences for example, Sami reindeer herding, Sami fisheries, and so on. This sort of ignorance of the experience-based knowledge, but it doesn't seem to sort of get acknowledged in the university space still. So there is a independent Sami higher education institution, but in the mainstream institutions, I would say that the talk about these different knowledges is more on the level of sort of talking about different cultures, different perspectives, and so on, and it's not been part of sort of the investigation of how we think about knowledge and critical thinking about knowledge. And in education, critical thinking is very much constructed as this, can you locate the false news or the fake news? Is this right or wrong? Is it true or false? Very little on these nuances on where does this knowledge come from? What does it do in terms of power and so on? Yeah. I'm not sure if I reply to what you're asking, but
Yeah, thank you very much. I remember that Åsa raised their hand while you were presenting. Åsa, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
No, it's okay. No, I didn't have a question. Sorry.
All right. Nice to see you, Åsa. And
Nice
Penny.
to see you too.
Hi, Kristin, thanks for your presentation. It really resonated with some of the work that I do. And I was interested in you saying that you and your colleague left your post and collaborated instead with a TV channel, I think you said. So I was just interested in, I think probably quite a lot of people who, you know, do research that touches on race. We're aware that people respond to us in very specific ways, and it can be a bit of a career killer. But if you're committed, then that's not, you know, that's not the thing that you're most thinking about. So how does it impact on your academic career, and how do you walk that tension then of trying to stay firmly in places where you can speak truth to power, but also not speak so loudly that you get kicked out altogether?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a difficult question, though. But yeah, for me, it's what you're implying. Like if I try to sort of separate what I'm doing as a researcher from myself as a human being and the more existentialist level, I would say, then it would lose its meaning in a way, because this is something that involves myself as a human being and so on. So, and I do have, yeah, what you would call a tenured position at the university, which is the most privileged place to speak from in academia. But I know that a lot of people who does not have that are also afraid of raising their voices, and it has consequences for things like assessment of applications for research grants and for other positions and so on. But this is of course only based on my personal experience, right? So some people would say, you know, this is not really happening, although we are many who experience that this is actually happening. Yeah, but I would say that I'm also very privileged to have a tenured position, and then there is of course also a lot of independence in terms of how I want to sort of what I want to do. No one comes around and looks at what I do or say in the classroom, for example, with my students, right? So yeah. Yeah, I don't. I'm just maybe someone else also has experiences related to this. Must be other people in this room with the same.
Thank you, Diane.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely, okay. That's great. Because you mentioned in your talk about, I think it was Joanne who made in the speech, and because of how, of their sort of difficulty in teaching about, talking about racism, which I thought was very interesting, actually. Interesting, the wrong word, but sort of scandalous, really. But how do you find I don't know if you can answer this question, but teachers in general in Norway in terms of anti-racism? You mentioned about it's depoliticized, but teaching in the UK is very standardized. We have sets of standards and rules that teachers have to meet, which is as far away from any sort of politics as you can possibly think of. But do you find that teachers in Norway tend not to speak up for anti-racism much? I guess there'll always be pockets, but what's the general feel in the country from the teaching workforce in policy about anti-racism, its place in the curriculum and things like that?
Yeah, no, I think the main discourse is this discourse on we don't really have to talk that much about racism because we are concerned with diversity and sort of the positive. And what is often said is that, you know, racism is a strong word, so let's not go there all the time. Yeah, I also encountered this with students, and then I try to say that the question is not whether or not a concrete practice is to be described as racism or not, but how we can understand how racism influences our interactions and practices and so on. There are, like, the teachers who receive this award, they did, of course, speak up exactly for the need of teaching about racism. So they're not like, it's not a problem as such that they do this, but I think the problem is that what is sort of acknowledged is their like bravery, and I would say that it's good that they do this, but it's also part of their job. And somehow the students who are also and even more brave, sitting in the classrooms and also being re-traumatized and exposed during this teaching, they're not acknowledged. So the main challenge is not that they're doing it. It's a good thing that they're saying, you know, we need to talk about racism and so on. But the problem is that this is the thing that's acknowledged by the public, like their bravery. Yeah. So it's the white emotions that are protected, because these are predominantly white teachers.
White teachers, yeah. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else? Right, so I think I have a chance to ask a question, Kristen. I really liked the idea when you mentioned that intersectionality has been introduced in the documents or in the curriculum. So with that, how do teachers, or how do students, I'm more interested in students, how do they see racism in the classrooms that you teach?
How they experience, or how?
Yeah, so sorry. So intersectionality, for example, within intersectionality is not the if we look into intersectionality with the lens of racism, how do your students in the classroom see it as race, ethnicity, gender, and so on?
Yeah, what they would. Yeah, I'm not sure if I understood the question, but whether like intersectionality is approached through a lens of racism or not, because I think this is a challenge, right? That intersectionality becomes sort of whitewashed or removed from its sort of origins, which is within critical race theory and especially the intersections between gender and race. So it is, I think it's a concept that is misunderstood and misused also in a Norwegian context, to sort of conflate these differences and say, you know, we're all very different, so we're all individual different people, and then racism tends to disappear from this sort of sort of pot of differences, or so I think that it's intersectionality is also misunderstood or misused in the Norwegian context a lot.
Do you think that intersectionality cannot be subjective, or it can be subjective as well as collaborative?
I think that a misunderstanding is to sort of see it as only related to identity and not to the structures that sort of position you. So this is, I think, again, a challenge with how it's perceived and applied in the Norwegian context, that it's sort of individualized and positioned as something that has to do with only with identity and not with structural inequalities.
Thank you. And Oscar.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, if you could talk. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit if your decolonization toolkit has if you've been able to spread that with any people or groups or anything, or teachers in particular. And then I had another question, if you could maybe repeat a little bit what you said about what we need to start doing in academia, how we need to start changing our thinking or approach at university.
Yeah. Well, the frustration and dilemma with working from a decolonial perspective is, of course, that on one side you're trying to sort of reform an institution that you don't really believe in. But I also believe in sort of the small things that can be done here and now and can help to sort of make space for more voices and and do harm reduction here and now. So this toolkit is very much focused on the more sort of the work that can be done in the individual faculties or departments on critically assessing curriculums and assessment methods, teaching methods, how they invite different voices or not. For example, in my early childhood teacher education teaching in intercultural competence, we try to use a lot of different ways of expression. So we use arts and drama and other ways of expressing yourselves and your competences than the pure academic format, for example. So it's on this kind of level, like how you can sort of reform your teaching and practices here and now. And we have kind of spread it a lot, and we've also made another one that you also heard about more about Sami knowledges that also has gained a lot of attention. But what I would say is that sort of after these debates where so much resistance and pushbacks were raised, and this criticism, it still holds. Like I still meet it all the time, that decolonization, do you really want to go there, and isn't that a bit on the side? And so I think it's actually kind of a challenge also with the concept in the Norwegian context, that the concept is so taboo or associated with something that's very radical and dangerous, or but it's all openly available, and of course I don't have the full overview of who's using these tools then. Yeah.
Thank you.
You've got a hand up, Simon.
Yeah, hi. My name is Silja Anderson, originally from Norway, so I grew up. I understand very well what you're talking about in relation to the sort of cultural identity, I guess. Work in the UK within university context, and see very much I guess the British structure, but seeing it always as an outsider. So it's much easier and much more comfortable to watch it as an outsider than to watch it within Norway. I think I'm just interested to hear a little bit more about when you're talking about, I think, starting the debate. Because I think that, starting the debate with somebody who doesn't think there is an issue to be debated is very difficult. And I think that is a very similar issue we have in the UK as well as in Norway, is that talking about racism is very uncomfortable for everyone, and very few people want to acknowledge that there is an issue. So how has there been any progress within Norway in actually, I think, first of all, acknowledging the issue at hand in order to start the debate? And is there anything we can learn in the UK? I think in particular, I'm thinking in relation to, from our side as University Outreach, working with schools and teachers, who I would never dare to label in any shape or form, but we do know that we have difficulties getting hold of students sometimes because there are mechanisms that stops those students being able to progress as other students, if that makes sense. I'll stop there.
But yeah, but the question was.
Yeah, no, it's more kind of where, like, have you got any suggestions and where to start this debate with people who don't really want to talk?
Yeah.
Or institutions who don't want to talk.
Yeah, I do think a lot about this when preparing sort of talks for groups of teachers or colleagues and so on. And I'm, as you probably could see from my presentation, although I'm like talking from a decolonial perspective, I'm very much interested in sort of the particular or the knowledge production and then the knowledge. And one place that I find it quite sort of de-weaponizing to start is to talk about the need for having a curriculum that sort of tells the truth. And this is something that speaks a lot to this like liberal free speech white positionalities, that there's something here that's actually, it's not good enough, this history curriculum and this teaching about racism is not only interesting to counter racism, but it's also interesting as a social science subject and sort of understanding societal processes and structures in a precise and deep way. So this is somewhere I often start with the ones that I feel are not seeing this as part of their lived realities, which is often the case for people speaking from a white positionality that has also no sort of yeah, it depends on the context though that they come from, but I think that I'm not sure what to say about this idea that sort of the conversation is moving and people tend to want to see the hope in it, and that's people talk more about racism now than before and so on. But if you look at sort of history during the 20th century in Norway, and especially after the Second World War, and how public debate has been described, there's been these waves of like, well, now we're talking about racism. Like after the murder of the young boy Benjamin Hermansen in I think it's in the 90s, yeah, late 90s. Yeah, there was a young boy with African descent who was murdered by neo-Nazis in a very sort of cold-blooded, explicit murder. And after this, there was this debate in the media, and people were talking more about racism, and then it got more quiet, and then we have new waves like this. So I'm not really sure what to. I'm not that hopeful, actually. And the reason why is that I think that we don't ever go to the roots of these problems, which I think is related to coloniality. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know if Norway is the place to go sort of for the advice on starting this conversation.
No, I wouldn't go to Norway for advice.
No.
But I would go to you for advice. I think
Yeah.
that was my but I think it is an interesting one though. I mean, obviously I think everybody who signed up to the seminar today are, you know, very much looking for a way forward. But it is difficult when I think, you know, the situation is comfortable for the majority, and therefore it's difficult to change. I think that is kind of sometimes where it's difficult to introduce a conversation or the debate when the majority is quite comfortable with the status quo.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I'm sort of struggling sometimes to understand where to tackle things from.
But
yeah,
I
but
do
thank you.
think that this also, when I work with more, so I also work with my students with more like both with literature, with some of these sort of first-hand like these books that have come out in the Norwegian context lately, with people telling their stories in different like literature formats. So we're reading these and also engaging our own life histories. And of course, if it is a diverse group, then it's easier to kind of see each other's standpoints. And I feel like this is something that also appeals to sort of the majority white students, especially when acknowledging that there are also, they also have their experiences that are based on their concrete positionalities, although they're different, especially when it comes to racism, of course. But it's, yeah, to work with your own experiences and perspectives in meeting with others. I feel that this is something that also appeals to sort of the majority. Yeah.
Thank you. And I can see Åsa raising her hand.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking about what you guys were just talking about, and there's a lot of opposition to the terminology and like starting discussions, trying to start constructive discussions when we bring up our theories, critical race theories or critical pedagogic theories or decolonization and so forth. So I was wondering if you think like is there a way forward if we just start with the accepted terms, maybe more equality, diversity, inclusion, democracy, blah, 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 that are all in the steering documents and policies and whatnot. Is that a way forward in like unpacking and addressing those in opening up the discussion?
Yeah, I think that what is met with like the harshest pushbacks among students, for example, from my experience, is vocabulary related to whiteness. That is something that is very much opposed. And what I have found is that if I absolutely think that we need to apply the concrete language, and this is important also for, again, for talking about this precision of understanding and analyzing phenomena. So I try to focus on explaining why these concepts are important to actually sort of produce precise, nuanced knowledge about this phenomenon. But I've actually seen that if I, or experienced that if I sort of apply them in a natural way, like model the use of, for example, whiteness. And if I do this for a while before sort of introducing, now we're going to talk about whiteness theory, then there is a different process because I insist on them being relevant. So I actually find that quite, or at least it's important for me to do that, to sort of insist on their existence. So I actually don't think that we should start with the more, also because these concepts often obscure, so we don't understand what's going on if we only talk about diversity and democracy and so on. Yeah, I think this is part of the sort of activism, small scale activism we can do as academics as well, to sort of model this this language. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Christine and Diane, do you have anything else to add?
I suppose it's a question about how we build capacity in terms of teacher educators. You know, how do we upskill? How do we support? How do we engage our colleagues in teacher education in these conversations? Because if it doesn't happen there, it's really not going to happen with the students in terms of what their practices are, what their thinking is, and the impact it then has on children. So I'd be quite interested in your thoughts on how might we move forward with these conversations within the sector of teacher education.
Yeah, I think for me, the most important aspect has been to build networks with other people working with the same questions and in the field, because there is so much pushback, and also this also influences younger scholars at master and PhD level and whether they sort of dare to go there. And actually, a lot of students don't. They don't dare to go to critical race theory and the colonial perspectives and so on because they're sort of advised not to. So I think the networking and sort of visibility of the approaches and perspectives is very important, at least for me. Yeah. How do we go forward? Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I'm engaging in this work every day, sort of insisting to my colleagues that it's important and trying to make space and so on. But yeah, at least I think that the networking is very important.
That's a useful point, and the point that Christine made when she made her response to you. This is slow work, but it's ongoing, and we all need to just keep going, even when a lot of the time we might feel despondent about it and wonder what effect it's having, if any, and things like that. So that was a useful point Christine made. You know, it's slow work, but it's important that we keep going. And your point, Christine, about working together is the key. It's the answer, isn't it? To work together, to listen, to join together. Very important. Thank you. I think we'll make a close now. No other hands up, Simon, can you see?
No, I can't.
No, that's fantastic. We've had a very good response to this, and I said to Christine at the beginning, it's we have to keep going, and it's important that we do. We're really pleased that we could come together, and Christine could lead us tonight, this afternoon, in terms of continuing to hone our thinking. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And the recording will be available, made available by Vera, so we can share it further, and you can listen again as well. Thank you.